the next of our talks from Santha, who needs no introduction as our president. Her details are printed on the back of the sheet. She brings, of course, that element of academic rigour. Sometimes the word academic is used, we were talking, as a term of abuse. So, of course, they're very academic. And I once replied, so you speak as a woolly thinker, I presume. And there's a place for woolly thinking, because it's comforting and warming, and I'm not down on it, but nevertheless it's important that amongst the many gifts that the Holy Spirit gives to every Christian gathering, there are diversities of gifts. One of the gifts, of course, is the gift of discernment. And Santha's talk, Near-Death Experiences and Channel Writing, the need for discernment in an expanding field. And in a sense, it's been the task of the Church through the centuries, from New Testament times, the times of the Acts of the Apostles, you can see there, and through all the varied traditions that have emerged in the Church, the process of discernment has gone on. Sadly, sometimes it's been accompanied with fire and the sword, sadly, when people couldn't bear to be in the same world as someone who disagreed with their particular discernment. But as to remember that our life as Christians lives within the divine providence, within the life of active love that is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it's a dynamic thing. There are often two opposing bits of human consciousness. The one that is the protective and the conservative one, that wants to be loyal to tradition, wants to stick to facts and have everything laid down clearly. And then there's the adventurous bit of it, that I said I'm interested in my Christian ministry as the person on the boundaries, as you know, doing interfaith work, and we're all people who are interested in the boundaries, but in, as it were, this world and other dimensions. If I see a boundary, part of me wants just to step over it a smidgen, not necessarily to jump over it, but I'm rather distrustful of signs that saying keep out. On the other hand, it's very important that we do have a right caution, and we don't rush headlong into anything, whether it's something that apparently joyous or something that's apparently negative. We need the gift of discernment. And so, Santha, I'm delighted to ask you to address us on that topic from your great experience, both practical and personal, as well as the academic.
First of all, I'd like to start by thanking Marianne for her absolutely outstanding talk this morning, which, of course, by good fortune, ended on a note which makes a bridge into my talk, because she mentioned Eben Alexander and his very interesting book on his NDE. And he represents what I would think of as the high end, as it were, of the NDE writings. There are, books which are written about where the whole book is spent on one person's NDE, and those kind of books are usually very well thought out. I mean, a similar one, some of you may have encountered, is Anita Moorjani's book on her NDE, which I very strongly recommend. But the interesting thing is that, as I say, this is what I think of as the high end of the market, as it were. And in a way, probably those of us who started to become aware of NDEs, say perhaps 20 years ago or so, at that point, these were rather rare experiences. In the meantime, they've become a kind of explosive area of experience. And therefore, on your handout, I've written down some websites, some of which many of you may know very well already, but some websites which just demonstrate how much there are hundreds and thousands of these sort of experiences out there. And it's on the websites that people find a forum where they can share, often in a very brief form, in a paragraph form, their particular experience. So if I can just mention these websites. The one I put at the top is, as it were, the one, IANS, which is the International Association for Near-Death. I forget what the S stands for. But they are a very, as it were, I would say, balanced, sensible site. And I've put next as a comment, I consider them thoughtful and scientific. They have a very scientific approach to these things. So I would very strongly recommend that site, and indeed that is the kind of association that I'm sure our fellowship would want to have contact with. The next one down is a more, as it were, I would say in a sense, popular site, in that, the one which is called neardeath.com. I've said it records and sorts NDEs by religion without comment. Obviously, in its own way, it does an enormous service, but I think it's in a sense addressing ordinary people in a much more ordinary way, in that it simply will record, it'll put up on the site just about any experience simply as it stands. And as I say, there's a little bit of classification. As Kevin rightly said, we love, as a species, we love classifying and listing and sorting. So you'll have Buddhist NDEs and sort of Hindu NDEs and so on, and and Christian ones. It's quite an interesting site because it gives that span of religions. And you'll see that, for example, in Far Eastern NDEs, whether they're sort of Hindu or Buddhist, normally it's the heavenly bureaucracy which has made a mistake and summoned someone to death before their time, and therefore have to return them to their bodies. I don't know what that says about Far Eastern society, but there we are. The next one, NDEstories.org, I think is a site I've put up their little blurb they give about themselves there. I think it's a site I think again is very balanced, very sensible. It's very much taking its stance from the point of view of how do we increase consciousness and how do we see the evidence that consciousness survives this life. But I think it's again a site that I would personally feel very comfortable with, you know, if we had links with those people. And then the one underneath there, which is a site put up by the Christian Research Institute. This is an institute I personally knew nothing about, but they sound as though they're doing very much the same sort of thing as us. In other words, from a committed Christian perspective, they are conducting, as it were, rational, scientific types of inquiry into these experiences. But as I say, the critical approach is from a strictly biblical perspective, but attempts to be careful, balanced, and fair. So I think it's also an interesting site. The one underneath, Encounters with Jesus, Jesus' near-death experiences and religion. This is, in my view, a lovely site because the people on it are absolutely madly in love with Jesus in the nicest way. You know, for them, Jesus is obviously the center of everything, but it's not a doctrine. It's a lived experience of this, you know, the life-giving power of Jesus in the nicest sort of way. So I've said focused on Jesus in a passionate but non-doctrinaire way. It's the kind of site which lifts your heart. It's got a kind of childlike joyousness about it, which is very nice because, you know, some of these sites can be very, very glumly focused on sort of correct doctrine. Then the next site under that is trustinginjesus.com. Now, this is mostly about the end time. As you'll be aware, there are an awful lot of prophecies being received all over the world about the end time. You've got lots of people having visions and messages and prophecies and all sorts of things about the coming end. And these people are found in every denomination, every Christian denomination, within the Catholic Church as well as in various Protestant churches and evangelical churches. And those sorts of sites tend to be very much more focused on judgment naturally, and therefore they tend to be much more judgmental. Now, ironically, the two sites which prompted me to want to present this talk to you, have, in the intervening year since I made this proposal, been taken down. And they were both sites which were ostensibly, they were recording the NDEs of lots of people, and those NDEs were almost universally visions of heaven and hell, and very focused on judgment, and very much Jesus is the only road to salvation in a very simplistic sense. So I went through hell and I saw the Hindus boiling over there and the Buddhists boiling over there, and Buddha was among them, and this sort of thing. And I'd wanted to put that site on just to demonstrate why I think there comes a moment when you start to think to yourself, now hang on a minute, in what sense are these people having NDE experiences? As I say, that site has been taken down, and so has a site which I think came out of missionary activity in Korea. And that site has been taken down, but there are still some little bits of it. The one I've put down here, Divine Revelations, Sarang, is a Korean child's vision of final judgment. It gives you a flavor of some of the focuses on judgment. In this case, the child, Sarang, is a little girl of about 8, and she is the most delicious and adorable child. So if you just want a video clip of an absolutely adorable child, do go to that site. What you make of little children ostensibly having visions of, good and evil and heaven and hell and so on is very much up to you. Now, I wanted to start off with NDEs just to illustrate, as it were, the times we live in, that what started in perhaps the late 70s, early 80s as rather rare, one-off sort of phenomena, as I say, have become an industry by now. And so when you get into an industry, this is when you actually start asking questions. And my paper is going to be very inconclusive. I'm not actually going to come to any conclusions, but I do just want to ask some questions. And the reason I want to ask some questions is because in some ways we've been here before. When we look at the explosion of visionary writing in the late Middle Ages, we're in a very similar time. We've got sackloads of visionaries all across Europe in the sort of 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, the majority of whom are women. And the interesting thing is that obviously people were confronted then, as now, with having to ask questions. And so I wanted to try and draw some parallels between that body of material and the body of material we're looking at now. Now, obviously, in the Middle Ages, you're mostly dealing with visions. And the thing about visions is that they have a certain international quality, in the sense that a picture of the Virgin Mary you can recognize as the Virgin, whichever country you come from and whatever is your mother tongue. But things get more problematic when you have conversations with Jesus. Let me first of all just draw your attention to the modern phenomenon of channeled writing. If you see on the handout, I've just listed what most people will probably regard as the 4 major manifestations of this at the present time. And I'm sure that at least some of these will be familiar to many of you. The first is A Course in Miracles, Dr. Helen Schuckman. This was first published in 1976. The actual channeled messages started to come through to Helen Schuckman in October 1965, and the person speaking to her, the entity speaking to her, identified himself as Jesus Christ, teaching her Christian material. The Course in Miracles, of course, has become absolutely massive. It's not only sold millions of books in something like 22 languages. It has spun off. There are major writers who write books themselves to help to explain the teaching of A Course in Miracles. And it's controversial because on the one hand, and I do think this is very important, on the one hand, it takes some of the aspects of the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels and brings them to the fore in the way that a lot of the mainstream churches have forgotten to do, as it were, or failed to do. So in particular, A Course in Miracles is fundamentally all about the power of forgiveness. It's forgiveness that generates miracles. And of course, if you go back to the Gospels and look at them, you'll see that on almost every page, Jesus is saying, do not judge, do not condemn, forgive, etc. And the way a lot of the main denominations conduct themselves, you really wouldn't think that that was a major plank in Jesus's teaching. It's more, oh yes, he did say the odd thing about forgiveness somewhere or other along, but a lot of the churches are much more embroiled in issues of where you draw the line in terms of moral conduct and so on. So I do think that something like A Course in Miracles and everything it has spawned, a lot of what is written off as sort of New Age Christianity, does in some ways focus on the actual teaching of Jesus in a way that, as I say, the mainstream churches have forgotten to do. So that is what I would say in its favour. Of course, from the moment it appeared, a lot of Orthodox Christian churches immediately attacked it. And in fact, one of the close circle around Helen Schuckman, when she was first writing, channeling these writings, was a Catholic priest who initially was very supportive and subsequently declared that she had been misled by a demon, that this was a demon masquerading as an angel of light. And what lies behind that is that in terms of Christian doctrine, there is relatively little emphasis on, say, the crucifixion. It does acknowledge the crucifixion, but it says that it was not God who, in any sense, who required the crucifixion. I mean, the crucifixion was done by men to Jesus. And again, in some ways, that's worth thinking about. But obviously, it's not taking the crucifixion as this central, fundamental, sort of necessary act that most Orthodox Christianity would take it to be. So I think that's the main problem, perhaps, with the Course in Miracles. But it also attracted a lot of criticism because it, and again, all the kind of books that have spun off from it, argue that at the end of the day, there's no real distinction between God and our true self, as it were, that fundamentally we are all not just a part of God, we're profoundly one with God. And this, of course, seems to obviate everything that traditionally we have said about sin, about our fallen nature, and also about our creaturehood, that as creatures, we have necessarily inbuilt limitations. Therefore, we cannot, in a sense, be one and the same as the infinite God. And obviously, it's a very Hindu kind of doctrine to say that your true self, your Atman, as it were, is the same as God. So that's attracted a lot of flack. One of the reasons why I'm dwelling on this is, as we'll see when I go back to the medieval material, that was exactly one of the issues at that time as well. Now, just to look at the other people on the list here, Neil Donald Walsh, I don't know how many people are familiar with him, but he's written a series of books called Conversations with God. This started as a trilogy. I think we're now on number 7 or 8, and various spin-offs like Conversations for Children and Conversations for this, that, and the other. Very very compelling because attractively iconoclastic, in a rather nice sort of way, very bouncy sort of tone and atmosphere, which I'm sure is partly why it's very attractive. And what I would say about this is that it's very much in the same kind of general mindset as the course. One of the aspects of this kind of writing is that it is very, very tolerant of human mess and muddle, therefore very accepting in particular of the disarray caused by sexual morality which doesn't obey the rules. Neil Donald Walsh himself has had, I think he's on something like marriage number 7, which he's very sort of accepting and humorous about, that, you know, he's obviously just not very good at marriage, but he likes to keep trying, you know. Jane Roberts, I've put down a whole series of books apparently channeled from an entity called Seth. Again, she actually received these channelings from Seth starting in the 1960s, 1963 until about 1984. I can't remember if that's roughly the time of her death or not. And because the Seth books started coming out before Donald Walsh or the other one I put on the list, the Abraham books, again, they were very much a target for a lot of bitter Christian sort of rejection and judgment. They found Seth absolutely wicked. I must say there are YouTube clips on the internet of Jane Roberts channeling Seth, which I find a little bit scary, I must say. They're a little bit peculiar in my view. However, if you look at what Seth says, you really can't pick much of a quarrel with things like this. There is never any justification for violence. There is no justification for hatred. There is no justification for murder. Those who indulge in violence for whatever reason are themselves changed and the purity of their purpose adulterated. If you do not like the state of your world, it is you yourselves that must change, individually and en masse. This is the only way that change will be effected. When you curse another, you curse yourselves, and the curse returns to you. When you are violent, the violence returns. There is no man who hates, but that hatred is reflected outward and made physical, and there is no man who loves, but that love is reflected outward and made physical. So that's the kind of teaching you've got in the Seth books. And I would say that, just as I was saying about forgiveness in the Course in Miracles, I would say that in this entire body of writings, the teachings of Jesus, which sound rather similar to that, are center stage and taken seriously in a way that has got a little bit eclipsed, as I say, in a lot of the mainstream churches. So one could make a case for saying that, okay, Christ on the cross tends not to figure in these writings. So, okay, Christians feel very uncomfortable doctrinally with some of these writings. But none of them are saying, arm yourselves to the teeth and go and wipe out all your enemies. You know, the purity of the religion is absolutely fundamental. Everybody else must be wiped out, you know. So I think one of the ways that we can take the teaching that Jesus is the only way to the Father is to remember that when Jesus describes himself as the way, he is indeed a way. It's not necessarily a label. It's not, you know, if you go and gun down people in the name of Jesus, that's okay. It's what you actually do. The name of Jesus is the nature of Jesus, the substance of Jesus, the character of Jesus. And one would have to say that that character comes out quite strongly in these channeled writings. So I think that's why Orthodox Christians have a genuine need to think about this material and not simply, as it were, just be dismissive of it as all dictated by the demons. The last bit I put down there, Esther and Jerry Hicks, the Abraham books. Abraham, in this case, is the collective name for a group of entities who channel through Esther Hicks. And Jerry helps, her husband helps her, he's now died, and helps her write up the books. And again, Abraham utters what by now has become, one would say, the established body of doctrine of this kind of writing, which is that we are all at the end of the day part of God, identical with God in a way, and therefore we have this power to affect what is around us and in a sense create our own lives, because, as Seth says, a curse comes back to you and hatred changes what is around you, and similarly love physically changes what is around you. And therefore the Hickses talk about the law of attraction, that as it were what you put out there is what you get back. Now, I think the Abraham books are a tiny bit more problematic than some of the others, because they put much more emphasis, or they seem to put much more emphasis on manipulating your life, as it were, to get what you want. You want lots of money, a beautiful home, smashing new car, fantastic job. By the law of attraction, you will attract these things to you if you put out the right kind of energy of hope and faith and generosity and positivity and so on. So I think again Christians start getting a bit nervous, because here there's a whole issue of who fundamentally is in charge, whose will are we doing, to what extent is this a kind of do-it-yourself program to make an earthly life that seems good to you in earthly terms, as opposed to the long, long history in the Christian churches of wanting to do the will of God, obey the will of God, even at some cost to ourselves, and with the understanding that in the process of bringing about something very good, God may lead us through some things which look very bad, I mean, it's interesting that many sort of modern saints whom we would regard as, I don't mean by that necessarily officially canonized, but whom a lot of Christians would regard as saintly figures, like some of you will have heard of Peace Pilgrim, the American woman who walked end to end of the US for years and years and years for peace, owning nothing. I mean, just literally in what she stood up in, toothbrush in one pocket, that's it. No money, no nothing. The Lord tends to lead them through very recognizable patterns of life. So she had to bring up her children as a single mother living in a caravan or whatever for years and years and years. She then espouses this life of complete renunciation of everything. This is much more the sort of pattern that we recognize from Christian tradition. It's not this ending up with several million in the bank and a beautiful home and so on. So that's another area where I think we were left scratching our heads slightly. So I just put that out there as something to scratch one's head about. I'm really not too sure what conclusion one might come to, except that when we focus all the time on people like St. Francis and all the rest of it who give up everything, of course, for ordinary mortals, this is not a very cheery message. You can become quite terrified of ever surrendering to God, because you think he's going to immediately ruin your life, basically. And to give you an example, Catherine of Siena in the 14th century, she was the youngest of something like 22 kids or something. And she came from one of the reasonably wealthy merchant families of Siena. And therefore, all her older brothers and sisters had made successful marriages within that community. So they were all doing very nicely, living comfortable middle-class lives in Siena, one of the most beautiful cities in Italy. And Catherine, she had espoused this really total dedication of herself to God. She lived a very ascetic life. She earned a reputation at only the age of 21 as a great saint because during the plague, she felt God calling her out of her life of solitude down into the slums of the city to look after the people dying of plague, which she did, and she survived, and so everybody considered that she was obviously a saint. But anyway, when she was praying for her family, she felt that there is such freedom and joy and fulfillment in being totally dependent on God and on nothing else, that she earnestly prayed to God that all her older brothers and sisters would be absolutely ruined and lose all their lose all their property and everything. And being a great saint, God heard her, and sure enough, one after the other, they all ended up in absolute penury and homelessness. Whether they discovered the joy that Catherine wanted them to discover, I'm afraid we don't know. But I think there's only one moral from that, which is pray to God you do not have a saint in your family. So as I say, it could be that as the inheritors of 2,000 years of this, we're actually hindering ourselves with very frightening pictures of what total dedication to God might look like. And therefore, it's quite possible that some of this modern material, with its very materialistic emphases, in a way is perhaps a corrective, which is not displeasing to God, because presumably, just as we were hearing about with the angels this morning, at the end of the day, he wants to look after us, take care of us, protect us, make us happy, and in a way, until you've got that conviction that God does want you to be happy and joyful and taken care of in all your needs, however minute, you can't really make this leap of faith whereby you're happy to have any obvious means of support taken away from you because you have total confidence that the Lord will actually take care of your every need. And Peace Pilgrim, for example, is a wonderful witness to that. She was always housed and fed, and she felt, well, she was very healthy, very happy all her life long. You've got someone very similar in the Orthodox tradition, a nun called Sister Gabriel, who has now been canonized by the Orthodox Church. She lived during the 20th century. She lived a very similar life in that she came from a very well-off Greek Orthodox family I think living in Istanbul, or anyway, somewhere in the Greek area there. And she was very devoted to her mother, and so it never occurred to her to leave home and get married. And in her mid-30s, her mother actually died. And this was a shattering moment for this woman. And during the night, the icon of Christ that was in her room started to glow, and she felt she had a very strong message from Christ that she was to change her whole life and dedicate herself completely to him. And rather like Peace Pilgrim, from that moment, she refused to own anything or have money in her pocket ever. And similarly, but she had, she wanted to go to America, she wanted to go to England. She had confidence that the Lord would work out how to do this. And sure enough, she traveled all over the world. She spent time in India. She had a very full life. She owned one white dress only, which she washed out every night, and that was it. Any money she ever earned or was given to her, she immediately gave away to beggars at once. And then when she was in something like her 50s or 60s, she felt the Lord telling her to become a nun. She thought this was a completely pointless exercise. She wasn't terribly interested in doing that. But she entered an Orthodox monastery near Bethlehem in Palestine. She was there for a few years, and then she felt God calling her to be a hermit. And she actually lived a solitary life in the center of Athens in a flat, a little flat that someone gave her. She lived as a hermit in central Athens. But again, she illustrates that once you have this faith that the Lord actually wants you to have a full, rich life, then in a way you can make this leap and give everything away. But us ordinary mortals, how many of us attain to that degree of faith? So I think in a way, this modern reassurance that the Lord actually does want you to have a nice life and an expansive life, a full life, is possibly needed just now. Who knows? Anyway, now let us cast our minds back to the parallels in the medieval period. Now, there are some very close parallels. The questions I want to ask is, once you've got this kind of writing going, are you creating a set of expectations about what it should contain, what it should be like? In other words, people following on in the tradition of these channeled writings I've listed, would they be allowed to take, as it were, a different stance from we're one with God, we recreate our lives, basically? Has this become a kind of body of doctrine unofficially set in concrete, so that any subsequent writings are shaped by these expectations unconsciously to a certain degree? That's something we have to ask. And when we look at what I was describing as the sackloads of medieval visions, it's something we have to ask. People like Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, have visions of Christ on the cross. To what extent then does everyone who is serious about prayerful communion, as it were, with God, expect to have visions of Christ on the cross? To what extent is the culture encouraging people's experiences or way they somehow receive their experiences to take on one form rather than another? It's something we have to ask ourselves. Again, one of the things that's very interesting with all these kinds of writings is that most of the time you have a female channel, but she is very closely supported by one or two or three men who are the ones who basically do the writing up and possibly, we don't know to what extent, the ordering, the possibly editing of what's been said to make it in some ways comprehensible. So, for example, with Helen Schuckman and the Course in Miracles, her very close friend and boss was William Thetford, and the whole thing took up when the Catholic priest I mentioned brought on board Ken Wapnick, who is the man who in the end is the most responsible for publishing the Course in Miracles. And they worked with Helen to type up what she had handwritten and order it and edit it. And I believe it was Ken Wapnick who basically created the chapter divisions and the sort of sections and decided which order it was to go in. And when we look at people like Catherine of Siena or another Franciscan, Angela Foligno, or Bridget of Sweden herself, we see exactly the same thing. These women are closely surrounded by male disciples who are often quite high up ecclesiastics. They're the ones writing up their visions and putting them out there. And there's an obvious advantage with that, which is that these visions then go out with the stamp, with the authority of the medieval church behind them. And we can guess that a certain amount of vetting has gone on in the writing up process to possibly remove anything which seems a little bit too far out in terms of the doctrine of the time. So you've got a very similar pattern there of how these things actually happen. People like Catherine, who obviously had an enormously charismatic personality, she was followed by such an obvious band of male disciples that they were called the Cateranati, meaning the people who had been Catherined, as it were. They were, sort of totally dazzled and overwhelmed by Catherine. So one of the issues, both then and now, is we don't know how much interpreting, as it were, shaping and interpreting has already gone on before the material gets out there. One of the reasons why Julian of Norwich is so interesting is because there does not seem to have been that kind of assistance in her case. We from her writings themselves, we don't hear or see of her collaborating with any person to try and get these writings into any kind of shape. The reason why, as far as we know, very few manuscripts of her writings circulated in the Middle Ages is because she did not have behind her a group of high-up ecclesiastics or an order which would want to make multiple copies and get the stuff out there circulated in the order. And, of course, one of the things about Julian is that she does rather push the envelope doctrinally in some ways, in that she sees no wrath or judgment in God. Possibly one of the reasons she's so popular in our own time is because in that she seems to tie in somewhat with the kind of teachings you're getting in the Course in Miracles and these other channeled writings. This conviction that God is totally loving and accepting of us, and he's really not wasting his time and his effort and his energy judging us for our sins. But the interesting thing is, when we look at Julian, there is one huge difference, which is that everything for her starts from her beholding of Christ on the cross. So for her, these slightly new agey, as it were, aspects of what she understands come out of the crucifixion of Christ. That is absolutely central. And that makes her very different from a lot of the modern writings, which really have a great respect for Jesus as a teacher and guide, but, as I say, tend to either say nothing at all about the crucifixion or not quite sure what to say about it, sort of sideline it a bit. So we have to ask questions about, is there already a framework of interpretation in place? Okay, also, are we creating, as I say, sort of bandwagons for people to jump on? I think given, once you get huge amounts of NDEs or channeled writings or whatnot, people with certain agendas are going to possibly be saying, oh, well, channeled, the entity channeling thisness tells us this or that. You begin to develop an agenda of some sort. So, for example, those websites I told you had been taken down, very full of visions of heaven and hell and so on, there is fairly obviously a particular doctrinal agenda. Now, interestingly, with Seth, for example, various other people during Jane Roberts' lifetime started saying that they also were receiving channeled writings from Seth. And Seth told Jane Roberts that no, he was not communicating with anyone else. Thank you very much. So this opens a very nice question, because these other people who thought they were channeling Seth, what did they think they were doing? Was Jane Roberts wrong in saying that Seth told her he wasn't using anybody else except her? You begin to get immediately issues of the right lineage, the true inspiration, the true doctrine, everything we're totally familiar with from the early history of Christianity and so on. But it also suggests to us that, obviously, we can't always put 100% confidence in someone's statement when they say, I was channeling this entity called whatever, you know. Even, as I say, within these circles, we have issues arising which show us that we can't give just blanket credence or acceptance to any statement about these are channeled writings. So, I mean, I think that's just another question that I want to put out there, that you have to be aware that perhaps there are certain agendas going on. One of the agendas might be to say, yes, this person is my chosen center of inspiration and doctrine. This is Peter, this is the rock, not anybody else. Thank you very much, as it were. It could be that that is one agenda that naturally, we're human, we're all fragile. There's an element, Kevin was saying earlier, of perhaps a little bit of a messiah complex in some of the chosen channels. Something to be aware of. On the whole, I think it's too easy to dismiss a lot of these modern manifestations as people just wanting to draw attention to themselves and put themselves out there as great religious teachers and so on. That's a very easy criticism to make, and I think most of the time it doesn't actually advance anything, and I don't think that is actually the explanation for anyone being the author of these channeled writings. I think there's something much more complicated going on. Nevertheless, because we're human, inevitably you're going to start getting rivalries where people are saying, no, I'm the true channel, not you. Seth didn't talk to you. You can say Seth did, but he didn't. You know, so so we have these sort of issues. Okay, so going back to the Middle Ages, you have interestingly, a lot of stuff that we would now want, our skeptical culture that our two previous speakers have both pointed to, our skeptical culture might look back at some of the medieval visionaries with a great deal of suspicion. It's interesting that by and large, the church was comfortable with what they're doing. However, that's not always the case. And some people whom we find extremely interesting now were condemned and occasionally put to death by the medieval church. One of them being Hadovich of Brabant in the 12th century and Marguerite Perret in the 13th century. And Marguerite Perret, in particular, is rather like the modern channeled writings in talking about the complete breaking down of any distinction between the individual soul and God. And she talks about the stages of annihilation of the individual ego, as it were, in God, so that you come to a kind of state of total union with God where you have no awareness of yourself as a separate entity in any way. And the church decided this was heretical, and she was burnt at the stake. However, her book, which is called The Mirror of Simple Souls, then proceeded to circulate anonymously without her rather damaging name being attached to it. As such, it actually became a very popular text, and because most people didn't know that she had written it, it became a perfectly accepted text, which finds its way into many of the major compilations of the time of good spiritual reading. In England, for example, the Amherst manuscript is a compilation which contains the short text of Julian, several texts of Richard Rolle, things by some of the continental mystics, and it includes The Mirror of Simple Souls, Margaret Perret's text. So, not that long after her death, what had been condemned as heretical in her writings, people are accepting without too much disturbance. Either they're not really taking on board exactly the significance of what she's saying, or they've gone back to their Bibles and they've found texts which suggest that she may be onto something. I mean, in what sense, when Paul says, not I, and now, no longer I, but Christ in me, what is he talking about? You know, when Jesus prays that the Father may be in him and the Father and the disciples in him, that they may all be one, I in them and thou in me, that we may all be one. What is he praying about? And similarly, Hardovich, no one can quite now understand what the problem was, but she's, but she is very much talking about the same sort of thing, the annihilation of the individual soul, self-awareness, as it were, in God, that union of the soul with God. And then, as now, the chief objection of the Church to this was that it seems to break down the distinction between creator and created. And this is the main criticism of a lot of the mainstream churches now to the channeled writings, is exactly that it seems to break down this distinction. Now, the reason why people get het up about doctrine is because, certainly in its origins, doctrine is about what you actually experience in God. You know, it's not necessarily a set of ideas. It's a set of statements about how we experience God. Therefore, when you go back to the patristic period, when the doctrine of the Trinity is being formulated, that was incredibly important because it reflected people's actual relationship with God, their actual way of experiencing God, that they experienced him as one God in three persons, not simply as one God, as it were. And when the Nicene Creed was being formulated, and they were thrashing out famously, you know, the whole business about Christ being one substance with the Father and so on, at the end of each day's theological debate, they would go out to Simon Stylites in the desert and say, on his pillar there, a very holy man, and they'd hand up what they'd been writing about, say, okay, what do you think of this? Do you think this is true in the sense of your spiritual experience and knowledge of God lived through your life as a desert hermit? And if Simeon said, yes, that's fine, then they went on, and next day they went on to the next clause and thrashed that out. So, as I say, the reason why people get bothered about doctrine is because at the end of the day, it has a close connection with what you actually experience of God. And people look at texts like, when in the New Testament says, you know, I stand at the door and knock, and when anyone hears my voice, I will come in to him, and my Father will come in, and we will sit with him and sup with him. You've got a kind of relationship there of persons, which in a way you can only have that sense of dialogue and communion if there's the possibility of not just being one with someone, but also over against them, so you can talk to them, if you know what I mean. So that one of the reasons why Christianity gets hot and bothered about this total lack of any distinction between the individual and God is because it actually seems to, you have the pleasure of union, but it seems to bypass this capacity that we have to actually converse with God as one friend to another. You know, that to have that conversation, there has to be that element of separating out so you can actually talk to each other. And we're invited into a conversation with the Son and the Father, according to the words of Christ. God himself in the Trinity knows this pleasure of being in conversation with someone, having that dynamic to and fro between two or three persons. And you remember that Jesus says, where two or three of you are, gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of you. It's as though there's something special about that two or three. There's a dynamic there, there's a relationship there, there's something there which tells us something about God, what the love of God is, as it were, in God. Go back to Julian of Norwich. She is incredibly Trinitarian. everything she says always starts in terms of what is the root of this thing in the Trinity. So when she starts on her long disquisition on Jesus as mother, it starts with, there's a whole chapter first on how the three persons of the Trinity, as it were, manifest different aspects of the love of God and how they interact with that, before saying the second person's love is this maternal love, and it manifests itself first simply in the fact that we're created. We're born from our mother Jesus when we're born into this world, and so on. It's rooted very much in a very strong sense of this interaction within the Trinity. So as I say, when people, when the Christian churches, both in the past and now, get hot and bothered about this business that we can be totally unified, we can experience ourselves as simply one with God, with no distinction. As I say, they're not simply being, it's not simply an idea that is annoying them. As I say, it's all Christian doctrine ultimately goes back to lived experience. So, again, I just put that out as a question to ask. We may feel that many of the condemnatory reactions of the modern Christian churches to a lot of this material is mindlessly critical and rejecting. But I think there are, as it were, questions to ask.